Hello there. Thank you for tuning in. I'm a university lecturer here in the UK, teaching science-related subjects. Over the last couple of days, there's been an increase, a surge in the number of cases of coronavirus, especially in London and the southeast of England. And I thought I'd help explain a few things about why that might be the case. Before I do that, let me just tell you a few initial things first. So, what is COVID 19? People confuse COVID 19 with coronavirus, they interchange the two, but COVID 19 is actually the disease that's caused by the strain of coronavirus identified in China in 2019. Okay, that's the disease. The disease COVID-19 is caused by coronaviruses. So, what are these coronaviruses then? Okay, so it's coronaviruses are not new. They've been known for many years, many decades. What they are basically is a collection, it's a group of viruses, okay, that infect and cause disease in mammals and birds. Okay, and their genetic information is in the form of RNA, not DNA, but RNA. It's very similar, but there are many major differences. In human beings, coronaviruses can cause quite a few diseases actually, but mostly they cause respiratory tract infections. Where did this virus come from that causes COVID-19? So it was first identified. Doesn't mean it started here, but it was first identified in China, um, in the Hubei province, in a city called Wuhan. Okay, and it was in December 2019. Okay, so Uh, the actual first case of COVID-19, although it was identified in December 2019, when we look back, the first case of it was actually on the 17th of November in 2019. Okay. And what does COVID-19 stand for? You hear this term COVID-19. What does it stand for? Well, the COVID, coronavirus. D stands for disease, and 19 stands for the last two numbers of the 2019. Okay, so that's where the name comes from. COVID-19, coronavirus disease, 2019. Before I could explain why there's a sudden increase in the number of hospital cases in the UK, I thought I'd just give you some brief information about the virus itself. Okay. Okay, so the actual virus is in terms of its dimensions, its diameter is about 120 nanometers. That seems like a very big number, 120. But when you look at this nano bit, this N stands for nanometers. Okay, we're talking about something that's extremely small. Okay, it's about 100 times smaller in terms of its width. It's about 100 times less than the typical cell of the respiratory system. Okay, so when we look at respiratory cells in our bodies, they're about 11,000 nanometers wide. Okay, so this is about 100 times smaller. Okay, so that's how small we're talking about when we talk about viruses in general, really. When it comes to coronaviruses, especially the recent one that we're all interested in, there are some very important structural features that I'd like to mention to help explain how this virus works. Okay, so when we look at coronavirus, this is the image that you normally see on the television. Now, if we slice it open, okay, we do a cross section of it, and this is what it looks like. So you see the spike proteins, okay, and then there are other membrane proteins, and this is the genetic material inside. Okay, so we have spike proteins, we have these membrane proteins, we have this gray bit here. That's the viral envelope that's made up of fats. The sort of scientific word for fats are lipids. Okay, and obviously then there's the genetic material inside. Okay. Now, in terms of the bits that I wanted to mention in more detail was this spike protein, okay, and the genetic material and the viral envelope. Okay. Now the spike now the spike protein. This is the bit that's really important on the virus. Okay. It's actually used to get into the host cells. Okay, so if you think about the virus, it's just you breathe it in, it's floating around, and how does it actually get inside the cell? Okay, it's in a very fluid, dynamic environment, and it's not a straight case of the virus just attaching itself to the host or any one of the host cells. It needs something to anchor itself, and it's the spike protein which does this. Okay, the viral envelope, this gray bit that goes around the virus. Okay, this is the envelope. It's a lipid bilayer, and I'll explain what that is in a second or two. But it's made up of fats. Okay, it's made up of fats, and if you when you think about the information that we're given in terms of minimizing the spread, and we're asked to wash our hands, it is the soap's ability, the detergent's ability to break down these fats. Okay, and when you break them down, you basically disintegrate the virus. Okay, rendering it harmless and useless. Okay, so that's why washing hands is so effective. Okay, and another thing we have to consider is how the virus replicates itself, how it multiplies itself. Okay, it has all the information that's needed to replicate the virus is in the genetic material. Okay, and so it uses this genetic material once it's inside the host cell to use that machinery of the host cell to use this RNA to produce more virus cells. Okay, so now let's look at how the actual virus gets inside the actual how the virus gets inside our cells. Okay, how does the coronavirus exploit the host to make more coronavirus? So that's what its objective is. Okay, it's to get inside and just replicate itself and just make more and more copies. Okay, so here's the coronavirus, and here's a section of our cells. Okay, now this is when I mentioned that the coronavirus, this gray bit here, is made up of lipid bilayer, it's made up of fats. This is what a lipid bilayer looks like, and our cells are also made up of lipid bilayers. Okay, there's one layer here, and there's one layer here, and in between you get all kinds of other components sort of integrated into the membrane, um, into the virus lipid bilayer. You have the spike proteins and these other important proteins inserted. In our cells, you have all many similar kinds of components, okay, inserted into our membrane, and it's these receptors inserted in our membranes that the virus exploits to get in eventually. Okay, so if you think about the virus is just in the system, it's in our bodies, and it's looking for a host uh, to replicate itself. So it has to get in first. Okay, that's the main thing. So the virus needs a way to anchor itself, because if you think of this as a very dynamic environment, it's very fluid. It's just floating around. Okay, and it needs a way to actually bind, to stick onto something, uh, and anchor itself to stop it from moving further on, because it's found a suitable host. And the protein part on our cells that the virus exploits is this here. It's called ACE2. Okay, and it stands for angiotensin converting enzyme 2. Okay, so it exploits this receptor because what it does, if I just show you this little animation here, you can see that the virus comes along and its spike proteins are able to bind to the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor 2. Okay, it binds there, and by doing that, it's able to anchor itself in position, and that's the first thing it needs to do. Okay, anchor itself. Okay, and the second bit is is the fusion of the viral lipid membrane with the host cell membrane. Okay. In order for the contents, the genetic material, to get inside the host cell, okay, what we need is a fusion of the lipid membrane of the virus with the lipid membrane of the host cell. Now, if you think about this, if I give you an analogy, if you have two droplets of oil on some water, and then you see that the oil droplets come close together, and as soon as they're close enough, they fuse together. Okay, and this is what basically happens with these lipid membranes of the virus and of this of our host cell. They fuse together, and once they're fused together, this ensures, or this allows, the contents of the virus to get inside the host cell. Okay. Just a bit more detail. Once the virus spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor on our host cell, okay, um, the ACE2 receptor actually modifies it, cleaves this. It cleaves the virus spike protein. Okay, it cleaves it, and it's through this cleavage that we can get the fusion. We can bring together the lipid membrane of the virus with the lipid membrane of the actual host cell. Okay. If I just take a step back, so you can see through this animation here that once the membranes have been fused together, okay, this allows the insertion of the genetic material of the virus to enter the host cell. Okay, it's not just the genetic material; it's all the other contents of the virus as well, which are actually needed to help replicate the virus. Okay, so these are the sequence of events that need to happen, that need to take place for the successful entry of the virus genetic components and its other material to enter the host cell. Okay, so once the actual uh, once the actual virus is inside, okay, or its genetic material is inside and its other components, okay, that's it. Then that's all it needs, and then this is just a typical cell, okay, with the nucleus and all its other machinery, okay. And what it does, it basically, the virus exploits, it hijacks the cell to produce more of the virus. It hijacks all the machinery that the cell has, okay, uh, to produce more coronavirus. So it just makes more and more and more. Eventually, what happens is that the virus fuses with the membrane, the cell membrane, and it's released into the outside. The outside could be the extracellular fluid, okay, and because it's fluid obviously is dynamic. It moves. It then takes it to new cells, adjacent cells. Adjacent to these cells could also be a blood vessel, so it could get into the bloodstream and then take it elsewhere into the body. Okay, and that's why if it infects other organs, because this ACE2 receptor is expressed in other organs as well. Okay, that's why it can do damage elsewhere. Okay, so that's kind of the life cycle of the virus. Okay, now we know that this ACE2 receptor is critical. Let me just take a step back. Um, we know that this ACE2 receptor is critical for infection. Okay, now th- we have to consider a few things here. Okay, now people are different. Okay, some people everyone expresses ACE2. Okay, but they express ACE2 differently. Okay, some people express more than others, perhaps. Okay, um, and the fact is, the more ACE2 receptors on the cells you have, the greater the chance for successful integration of the virus into the host cells, okay, or the successful binding of the virus to the host cells. Now, if you just think about this, the more ACE you have, the more receptors you have in a cell, or the more ACE2 receptors you have in a cell. If you can just picture this, okay, if there's just one ACE2 receptor on a cell, the chance of a virus just coming along and finding that is very low. But then if you have 100 ACE2 receptors on that same cell, the chances of that virus finding an ACE2 receptor becomes higher. So it's really a concentration of how many ACE2 receptors you have on your cells, which make you more susceptible to the binding and subsequent infection of your cells. Now, people who are on hypertensive medication actually express more ACE2. Okay, the medication that they take makes them express more ACE2. Okay, and that is why people with certain underlying health conditions, okay, that are perhaps on hypertensive medication, maybe they're heart patients, and maybe they have some cardiovascular disease. Okay, they want to minimize, they want to lower blood pressure. In those cases, ACE2 is increased. Okay, and that's why people uh, who have these underlying conditions are more susceptible, are more sensitive to the virus. Okay. Now, in terms of organs, lungs express ACE2 much more than many other organs. Okay, so the expression levels of ACE2 is naturally higher in lungs, and then people who are on hypertensive medications, their ACE2 levels actually is a lot higher further. Okay, and this explains why the lungs are more sensitive to infection, and the reason why COVID-19 leaves patients with respiratory problems. Okay, so even if you think about virus particles as that are floating, perhaps someone has sneezed and this virus particles floating around, people breathe it in. Okay, in the first place, obviously you breathe it in into your respiratory system. So the first access that the virus has is to your lungs, and the lungs express more ACE2 naturally. Okay, and then people with underlying hypertension diseases actually express even more ACE2. Okay, making them much more sensitive. Okay, making them much more sensitive and making them more prone to respiratory problems when they contract the virus. Okay, so ACE2. Now let me just take a step back for a second. Okay, and let me just okay. Now this angiotensin converting enzyme is a very important enzyme because it helps to regulate fluid volumes in your blood. Okay, and that's why people who are on cardiovascular, who have got cardiovascular disease and they want to minimize their chances of having a heart attack, for example. Okay, and one of the triggers for heart attacks is high blood pressure. So we want to minimize blood pressure, and one way we can minimize blood pressure is by reducing the volume of blood. Okay, and ACE2 is a critical cog in that pathway that helps to regulate blood volumes. Okay. Now, this is not a. I'm not going to talk about ACE2 in more detail than that, but just to give you some context of what ACE2 actually does. Okay. Now, so ACE2 on the actual host cell is very important as a means for anchoring the virus onto the cell. Okay, but the spike protein, okay, um, is obviously important as well. So the condition of the spike protein. Okay. Now, spike proteins on a virus can bind with different strengths to ACE2. It's not a simple case of if there's a spike protein, it will bind to ACE2. Okay. There are certain modifications on the spike protein. Um, so in some variants, the spike protein will bind tightly. In some of the variants, it won't bind as tightly, and there's degrees of tightness by which the spike proteins actually bind to ACE2. Okay, so if the spike protein binds very well, okay, and you need to picture this in your minds, if it binds very well, then the chance for successful binding to a host ACE2 is bigger. Okay, that's just logic, isn't it? The easier it actually binds to it, the greater the chance that it will stay bound. Okay, so this helps to explain the actual main purpose. little presentation, which was to explain why there's been an increase in the number of cases in the southeast of England. Okay, so these new patients, what the scientists have been discovering is that mutants or mutations have been observed. Okay, now these mutations uh, give rise to a difference in the makeup of the spike proteins. Okay, and what they do, these mutations, what they've done is basically made the spike proteins bind even better to the ACE2 receptor. Okay, before they were binding to the ACE2 receptor quite well, but these new variants, okay, have modified the spike proteins in such an interesting way that they actually bind to the ACE2 receptor much better than before. Okay, which then gives them a much bigger chance that they bind to ACE2, okay, and then stay bound and make them more infectious. Okay, so it actually makes them much better binders to the ACE2, okay, making the virus potentially more infectious. Now, I say potentially because with science, you have to be really careful when you're making statements. You have to be completely and utterly sure of those statements. So, at the moment, the amount of research that's being done isn't sufficient to say that this is the reason that makes them more infectious, but it certainly makes them more potentially. So, potentially a better candidate to explain why these new variants, okay, are leading to much more cases at the moment. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to say about coronavirus. Um, if there's anybody who wants to know more about this, then please leave a comment. Um, Consider subscribing because I'm in the process of making more of these types of videos. So please do leave a comment behind. Let me know what you think. If there's anything that you weren't sure about, again, just make it known in the comment section. And if there's anything else that you want to know about that I could perhaps help to explain, again, leave a comment. Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and stay safe. Bye bye.